verse 21. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, that they may not lose heart. That's what we ended last week. That they may not lose heart. What's exasperate mean? Exhaust. That's what it means. It means to constantly pick and berate and put down everything. To exhaust your children with overbearing, nitpicking, just berating them that way. Right? He says don't do.
They can't do anything right.
They can't do anything right. That's correct. You've probably seen or heard people before that you think, man, that's rough. He's giving his person a break. Well, that's what a father's doing to his kid. And he says here, don't do that. They might lose heart. They might really think they're worthless if you tell them they're worthless enough. And if that's the case, then they're going to lose their heart. And then they'll think that they're failures, and then they won't be the people that they could be. Okay, so it says, fathers, their instructions. So he's given children to obey your parents in all things, as to the Lord. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, be subject to your husband, as is fitting in the Lord. How many times in the New Testament does it tell wives to love their husbands? Can somebody find where it says, wives, love your husbands?
Many times it tells husbands to love their wives.
Okay.
Ephesians 5.
What's it say?
Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Oh, they didn't say love.
Oh, okay.
There's a scripture somewhere I can't remember right now, but and then it says when the older women are to teach the younger women to love their husband and their children.
Right.
Titus chapter 2.
Right. That's the instructions that we have, is for the older women to teach the younger women to do what?
Love their husbands and their children.
Love their husbands and their children, right. But the instructions here that Paul has always given is for the wives, then it says in I think the Philippians letter 2, to be subject to their husbands. We talked about this a bit last week. But it says for the husbands to love their wives. That's been said before, right? Some of these similar letters, these sister letters that were written while Paul was in prison, said these very things. But now we're going to get into a different relationship. This relationship is one of the slaves to the masters. Okay? Slaves and the masters. It says in 22, slaves, in all things, obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. All right. Let's talk about that a little bit. Slaves, obey your masters.
Translation says slaves.
Slaves.
It says
Servants. Servants. Slaves.
Yeah, it says servants here.
Servants.
It's the same idea, yeah.
Same idea. So what is a slave? In the context of what we're talking of right here, what is a slave?
A slave is someone who has a master over him. Tells him to go when he needs to go and come when he needs to come.
Okay. Okay. Indebted to. Right. It's an indentured servant, meaning what you're talking of here, you owe something to someone, but ultimately it means it's a person who doesn't have rights past that of being property. That's what a servant or a slave would mean in the context that we're reading about here. And it says there to obey their masters, those who own the rights to them. Okay? Now, We have to put this in the context. All right, the context 2,000 years ago, this wasn't an illegal behavior. I'm not saying that it was a right behavior, but it wasn't an illegal activity. It wasn't illegal for someone to own the rights to another person because they owed them something. Does that make sense?
Well, most countries, as far as I know, today, it's illegal to have slaves. It is in this country. Purchase someone else
Right.
is against the law of the land.
Right. Yeah. Well, in this country, for sure, you don't buy and sell people, right? That's an undescribable, terrible thing. But it wasn't that way 2,000 plus years ago. Now, we're not talking also about someone or being in captivity. That's different. You know, if you've been taken into captivity, that's different than being a slave. What we're talking of here. This is the indentured servant. This is the person who has owed something to someone to that they are then their property. Right or wrong about the situation, that's what we're talking about here. Does that make sense? So we have to think about that in the context of what we're reading about here. Not an illicit, illegal behavior. This was something that was done. And it says that to obey those who are your masters on earth. Not, it says, with external service. What's external service? What do we call that now?
Not just pleasing to the eye.
Not just pleasing to the eye. What did you say there? Working. Yeah. Not just with lip service, right? Don't just please them to smooth them over. We may call it kissing up or something like that, right? Not just that way, but it says to do it sincerely, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord.
Connected with this would be the idea of somebody who works so long as the master is around.
Yes.
If he went in the house, if he went whatever, on a trip, whatever, and left you to do the work, and you're a Christian, he left you to do the work. And then you're going to be lazy and not do it and lay around and, not be obedient in that sense. See, that's this eye service business, or the word that you said, I can't remember. But that's what that is.
Right.
When you're just doing it, or you're just working because somebody's standing over you, breathing down your neck, making sure you do the work. And he says Christians don't act like that.
Right. Now, we have bosses, right? We have people who we work for, who pay us to do a service, right? We don't call it this type of relationship, and it's not that type of relationship. But you can say the same things apply, because if a person was a slave who then had to serve his master with all sincerity of heart, how much less would we, having freedom, need to serve that which we worked for? Right? Not laying down on the job, not clocking in at the wrong time, not hiding behind the tree while everybody else is doing something. Not the just working when somebody's watching. And that's what he's talking about here. But did Paul ever talk about the rightness or wrongness of being a slave or being a slave owner? Did he ever talk about that relationship at all? Philemon, all right? That's right. But did he condemn that relationship? No, he didn't.
We have to think about what you said. It's a different time, different set of circumstances, and the culture is different. I mean, the Smithsons came to the United, or the colony in 1700 as indentured servants. I mean, it's just, it was.
Yeah, so they owed somebody something.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they worked 15 years and were free and had land with them as part of it.
Let's see.
You know, you can slant it in a direction to, talk about the one service, what the slave duty is to the master, but there's another side of it too. The master has a duty to the slave.
Right, that's right. We'll get to that here in just a little bit about what that relationship means. Now, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 21, now this kind of touches on this point a little bit. It says, "Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that." Right? So Paul acknowledges that there is benefits of not being a slave, but Paul never writes that there should be some bloody revolution to get out of slavery. Right? Paul's just talking about the relationship of a slave as a what? Christian. Right? This is a Christian slave. All right. Verse 23. "Whatever you do, do your work heartily, for as for the Lord, rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve." Verse 25. "For he who does wrong, will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality." Okay, so he gave more specific instructions to slaves than he did to husbands, wives, and children. It meant something, didn't it?
In the days of the first century like this, Rome, the city of Rome, had more slaves than they did free people, the population of Rome itself. And then you go out from there, there's more slaves, and then you go, what you're talking about, whenever you think about the people conquered by Rome, then they're essentially slaves to Rome. And so whenever you have these types of verses, it's because you've just covered, a large section of the population anyways. And so then if that's the case, then most of the Christians are going to be in some form of servitude. Now whether it's, now Paul said he was freeborn, so that made a difference. And then one time there's a fellow that said he purchased his freedom. And there's things like that went on all the time. But so many people, that's why you have to deal with it, because so many people are going to fall into this category of having to serve somebody else in one form or another. And you mentioned indentured servants, it'd be a similar idea. They had to pay off a debt and put themselves in the service of somebody else. And we do that today. We still have forms of that yet today, where we put ourselves in the service of somebody else to pay off a debt or pay off something, whatever. And then I was thinking about, a lot of times we put children like that. They used to anyways, maybe not do it too much, but used to, if, little Billy broke the window, the neighbor lady's window, then if he did that, well, here's little Billy, he didn't have any money, but he could mow her yard for about a month or so, 6 weeks, and quote unquote pay off the window. So he had some service he did because of something that he'd done. And things like that go on, still go on. But these folks would have had that situation and even more. You've been servants. So here's the majority of the population. You better tell the servants how to act. how they need to treat other people, those in charge. And then like Dale said, God has something to say about the masters, and that's going to happen too in a minute. But right here is how the majority people need to be.
So let's compare this relationship then with that relationship that a Christian has with Christ. What does Paul call himself? Many times. A servant, a bond servant. Right? A bond servant for what? For Christ. That's why he's writing this letter right now. He's in jail. Right? He's a bond servant. So if you start thinking about this relationship and the descriptions that is poured forth here, you start thinking about, well, that's what my relationship is with my Lord. Isn't it? Obey in all things, not with external service, pleasing to men. Whatever you do, do heartily, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of inheritance.
Here you have a master that's a Christian.
Yes.
You have a servant that is a Christian. And they know what equity is. They know how they should treat each other. And there shouldn't be any problem at all for the servant being treated right and for the master being treated right as what he is supposed to do.
So let's look at verse 25 one more time. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done. Explain what that means. What would we say to that?
Read it again.
For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done. And that without partiality.
And we have King James version, the latter part of that verse is, and there is no respecter of persons.
Yes.
So, you know, we're all living on the same roof.
Yeah.
We're up under that. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done. There be there.
Yeah.
Good.
Wonder why that's in here. Wonder why that verse, wonder why it was fitting for that to be here when he was talking about these relationships that these people have. Right here in the middle of that.
They say that you would get a reward, so if you don't do right, then I guess you won't get a reward either. You get the opposite.
Yeah, very good. What now?
The verse before, you know, we talked about
Oh, I
that
see.
if you
Yes.
do this, you know, your reward, you have the inheritance. So the opposite of that, that if you do wrong, then you're going to receive the wrong for what you've done.
Okay. So you do right, it says there. You do what? You get a reward of the inheritance. Or you do wrong, and there's consequences to pay.
Well, according to the scriptures, you know, I like this in the King James version, and there is no respect of person. No, everybody's gonna be treated according to the scriptures, according to what the truth is, that we bear up under and live it. And he's not any different than I.
Right. I think that's important when we read that. In this last part it says, and that without partiality. Now, in the relationship of the slave and master, there's partiality. Right? The owner gets his portion. But here is not saying that. This is saying that when you mess up, the consequences of those mess ups then are going to be upon everyone equally.
It could be that 2 or more slaves, and they're all treated alike. There's no respecter from the master.
Okay? That's a good point too.
There is, well, I don't know which translation, but it's not favoritism.
No, that's right. That's a good point.
But how would that make a slave feel? In other words, if you're a Christian and you're a slave, how does that make you feel if you read the words or have them read to you that says there's no, like JD says, no favoritism, no respect to person? What does that do for you?
Land field flip.
Acknowledge that it's, she said, if it was a bad master, or a person who was unfair or mean to then that slave, there also will be consequences for them.
I don't know if this is a good example, but if you mortgage a house, and you're happy to live in it, and you're happy to satisfy your mortgage a house, writing a check will be more like a gratitude. Hey, thank you for giving me that loan. I don't know if this is a good example, but you have a heart of gratitude. So I don't know if I'm going to apply this right, but if you're certain, you're grateful that the master is good to you. Of course, I don't know if it depends on the master, but if the master is good to you, after I never said to the Lord, he's good to us, then we have a gratitude that the reward we're going to receive for that gratitude, gratitude that we're serving him is really everything in him.
Okay. Makes sense.
But it reminds me of what I said earlier about Philemon. You look at Philemon in verse 15, or I'm sorry, 16, when he says, don't look at him as a bondservant anymore, but as a beloved brother. I mean, you're talking about the level playing field. You're talking about the slave master and slave mentality. It all comes down to it. We're all sinners, obviously. And we're all equal in God's eyes. It doesn't matter what your social status is. You could be Jeff Bezos rich, or you could be Caleb Smith and poor. But and in reality, it's all the same. Because in reality, we go with debt to God. We can't pay regardless of that.
Right, it's a good point. You bring up a good point. Why would people think then that God is being partial to people like Mr. Bezos, who is the richest man, I guess, in the world at this point? Why is God being partial to them because they have more material things than I do? That they don't struggle with things that I have to struggle with? Is God being partial to them because of that? No. God's not being partial to them. Because we know God does not show partiality. Right? God shows no favors towards anyone. The idea here is, it doesn't matter what color you are, what gender you are, what anything you are, where you were born, where you were raised, in God's eyes, right, the same. When you die, you will be judged exactly the same as anyone on earth. Yes, that's right. And I think we've got to remember some of those things, that those other things, the riches and the wealth and all those like Caleb's talking about, they don't matter. Right? Because we're equal then in God's eyes, and we're going to be judged accordingly and equally for the things that we've done, for the consequences of the wrongs that we have done. Now, chapter 4. Chapter 4 goes into the relationship here again, the slave and the master, but from the master's perspective. And it says, their masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. So, is there any kind of confusion that you have here when you start reading these things? Where the instruction is to treat the slaves fairly and justly. inspired and written, but sometimes questions come up to think, well, I wonder why it wasn't written just to say, masters, free your slaves. If you're a pastor, instead of treating them justly and fairly, why not release them?
That wouldn't be right if there was an agreement that had been made
Okay,
between the slave and the master.
right.
As far as you're talking about mistreatment, that's the difference.
Right, and that's obviously condemned in these verses. Right? So this doesn't have, it's not, the writing is not the rightness and wrongness of who owes who, right? It's how that person is treated and how they're being treated. That's the concept here, right? So let's not read into it like our idea of slavery is bad, right?
We can't talk about it, in society.
No, and not in the context that, you know, that we have here in this country. That's not what this is here, right? Again, contextually speaking, we're talking about something different, something that was accepted by all, even the slaves, because then they knew that they owed something. And this is the relationship then. It says, masters, grant your slaves fairness and justice.
The slaves like we had here, isn't it, they was bought and sold and everything. A man, a human, you know, sold like animals. And even in the old law, they had a law, they wasn't supposed to do that then neither. God hated for, he told his people not to buy people for slaves. And to me, that's the big difference in this here. Like I said, Dale said, you basically put yourself in that position, I guess, and maybe whether it was could have been an accident, I guess, maybe you, somehow that you I don't know, you know, maybe he's down on your luck or whatever, you lost your money, you know, or something, or, I can't.
I know what you're saying. I do know what you're saying.
Go ahead.
I don't know the specific verse that we're talking about. Anybody, Jared, do you know? Dale? Billy? Anybody? The verse he's talking about the rightness or wrongness of
I don't know.
people's property.
There were several. There was one I was thinking of in Nehemiah where they got in trouble for that because the fathers had sold their sons because of trying to pay off a debt. Well, then they ended up taking them and trying to sell them again. And God got after them through Nehemiah and said, you shouldn't have done that in the first place. You shouldn't charge interest to your own people. And there was things like that went on. There was things about slavery where God was saying, essentially don't break up the family. And so, okay, you got the slave family out here. Well, in our country was records of people that broke up, and they'd sell the dad here and the mom here and the kids, and they'd sell them off like cattle. And there is a passage in Exodus that says, not to sell the family off like that. Like you have a family unit, you're not breaking them up, and things like that. I don't know. I see where you're going with some of this, Brett, and I'm not going to disagree that there was a lot of indentured servitude. But there sometimes they were just like slaves. They were just like property people. And that's what is happening here as well. And so when you ask the question, why don't you have a passage that says free all slaves, is because the Lord really didn't get into the political side of those things. If people, and Caleb read it just a minute ago, in Philemon and verse 15, and he says, treat him like a brother beloved. Can you treat your property like a brother beloved? Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, treat others the way you want to be treated. If I treat other people the way I want to be treated, will I treat them as my property? Matthew 22:39, love your neighbor as yourself. If I love my neighbor as myself, is my neighbor my property? And you start going down through these passages, and what you see is it does end slavery, but the way the Lord ended slavery was not by politics or not by a mandate, but by changing the hearts of people. And you change the heart of that person, and he looks on them and says, that's not my cattle. That's a man with a soul. You know, I can't look on him as cattle. I can't look on him as this is my furniture that I'm going to get rid of. And once that happens, then the whole system falls down, breaks down, because you can't have somebody. Now, if you want to talk about, now that's just flat slavery, but then you want to talk about somebody being an indentured servant, and that's a different animal, a different subject, but you'd still treat them as a human. You'd still treat them as a brother. If they're Christians, you're going to treat them as brethren. And then there again, the reason why you don't say free all slaves is because in that context, yeah, he's still owed a debt, and he can still pay it off. And so he's going to pay it off, and everything will be fine. And you can go from there. But that's what so much of this is. And there's your fairness from 24 and 25 of chapter 3. And there's the fairness of chapter 4, verse 1 with the master, doing what is just and equal. Don't forget you've got a master. See, you masters. Don't forget you got one. Somebody's watching you. And so that reminds me of when the parable and Jesus of the unforgiving servant, and the servant and the other one, and he forgave, and all that. And then that other guy wouldn't forgive. And then the king came back on that second guy. Well, why? He said, you got a master in heaven that's watching you. See, you got a master who's aware.
Well, I don't want to interrupt that, but one thing that comes to my mind is just, we think that our society is so far removed from slavery, but in reality, we're only 4 generations removed, or 4 or 5 generations removed. And when we think about, like what you said, why didn't this enslave or whatever, we have to think, for one thing, like we said, is that there was a different way of life back then. And some of these brethren, who very well may have been slaves to other brethren, if they, and this is very probable that it was, that if they were born in slavery, their parents were slaves, they had nothing, that was the only way of life they known. And had they been cut ties from slavery, they would have had nothing. They'd been destitute. And so in some of these situations, because it was so socially acceptable, it was a way of life for them. Maybe they needed to be treated a little bit better with some respect or whatever, but if they weren't in that situation, they could be destitute on the street. And I think that, to echo what Jared's saying, in some cases, it might have been necessary.
To get back to my point of why we talked about, why we would think, well, why wouldn't there be just verses in the Bible that say that how to end slavery? And Jared touched on it. When you start thinking about how we treat each other, right? How I would treat someone like my neighbor. I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, right? So my neighbor then is the person who works for me. So what other way can you end some kind of a travesty than by loving someone the way that Christ loves you? There is no other way. And Jared pointed out to that, and that's the hearts of men, right? That's the hearts of men will be the things that overcome those evil things. Because the things that happen even in this country, those were not done in a way that was loving and respecting another person. To want for that person at least as good as I have it.
Well, you can go back in this day and time and beyond, and history will tell you that life didn't mean very much. The Roman Empire was destroyed. And one of the princes, Jesus Christ, people could see this doesn't make sense. Jesus Christ done as much to destroy slavery,